So good afternoon everybody. Welcome to Joe and Mike's virtual tour of the Lawnmarket, which is part of the Royal Mile here in Edinburgh. From our last broadcast we had a few requests for a little shout out, so I'm just going to delve into my sporran and I'm going to just mention a few names, so say hello. I'm going over to the northeast of the United States, so I'm going to say hello to Candice Klinikowski from Odysseys Unlimited. Hi Candice, how are you doing? Looking forward to seeing your guests here next year. As you can see, Edinburgh is beginning to open up a little bit here. Going to go a little bit further south and we're down to New York City. I'm going to say hello to Camilla Hellman. Hi Camilla, Joe and Mike here. We were looking forward to coming over in April to the parade in New York, but unfortunately, things being what they are, we're looking forward to next year. So that's Camilla from the American Scottish Foundation. Now going down to New Jersey. There's a friend of mine called George Barbaro. I'll say hi to George, how are you doing? Looking forward to seeing over here in a few months' time. And then, of course, I cannot forget Veronica Werman and my Jersey girls who were on one of the tours last year around Britain. What a great tour we had there. It was absolutely fantastic. A little bit further south to Baltimore. Good morning, Baltimore. To Tia and Sam Schneidman. What a classic couple. They were on my tour last year as well. Looking forward to seeing you guys here again. And then, cannot forget my friends in Tennessee, the Chattanooga Ski Club. What a tour that was. So hello to Ashley and all the gang in Tennessee. And then over to Arizona. You must be up really early in Arizona to watch this, because I know it's 10 o'clock in the East Coast, but I want to say hello to Fern. Fern was with me about 2 years ago and we had a lovely tour around Scotland. Back to the UK, want to say hello to Nikki Stark down in Buckinghamshire. Hello Nikki, hope Freya and George are behaving themselves. Great to see you all. So that's a little shout outs.
Sharon Ogre, Joe is saying hello.
Hi Sharon, how are you doing? So glad you could join us. So good morning to all the people in the East Coast of the US. I know it's very early, but sit down, have your breakfast and enjoy your little virtual tour. So let's get back to the tour. We're here on the Lawnmarket. The Lawnmarket is part of the Royal Mile. The Royal Mile forms the backbone of the heart of the Old Town of Edinburgh. And I say the Old Town because Edinburgh is like a tale of two cities. We have the Old Town, where we are at the moment, and then we have the New Town. But in this city, everything is relative, because when we talk about the New Town, they didn't start to build it until the end of the 1700s. So you can only guess how old the Old Town is. But we're going to take you on a little tour and we're going to take you back through the centuries as well. We'll mention some of the characters that lived in the city, but also give you some of the architecture and some of the stories and maybe bring Edinburgh alive for you. But you cannot be in the Lawnmarket without looking at this great neo-Gothic structure behind me here. I'll just step aside, you get a great view of it. This was known as St John's Highland Tolbooth Kirk. Now Kirk is a Scottish word for Scotland. If you go right up to the top, the pinnacle of the spire there, that's the highest point in Edinburgh. It was built in the 1840s. There was a collaboration between two architects, James Gillespie Graham and Augustine Pugin. Augustus Pugin also designed Westminster Palace, or the Houses of Parliament down in London. It was actually built initially for the meeting place or for the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. And it was a meeting place up until 1929, and then it became back to being a church again. However, after the congregation started to decline, and back in the 1970s, the actual church closed, the congregations combined together and the church closed. It lay empty for quite a while. But in Scotland, we're very good at recycling things. We don't like anything to go to waste. So we like to recycle even our buildings here. So this building was then repurposed and was opened up in the 1990s, and it now forms the heart of the Edinburgh International Festival. This is where all of the effort to get this wonderful festival that they have every August here in Edinburgh all takes place in here. It's a lovely cafe if you want to go in there. And also, it's where you buy your tickets for all the shows. We don't give it that big name, St John's Highland Tolbooth Kirk. Big long name for it, for a big tall building. Nowadays we simply refer to it as the Hub. You can't miss it. It forms one of the best sites here in the Lawnmarket of Edinburgh. Let's move along a little bit further here. We're taking a little walk and we'll go on to the Royal Mile proper. And I have a question for you. How long is the Royal Mile? Bit of a trick question. I bet you're all saying, oh, it's a mile long. Actually, it's a little bit longer than a mile, but don't let anybody know I told you that. It's 1 mile and 1/8 of a mile, so 1 1/8. Now the Royal Mile is called the Royal Mile because it connects the castle, which is up to the top of the Royal Mile, with Holyrood Palace, which is at the bottom of the Royal Mile. Now the palace is the Queen's official residence while she is here in Edinburgh. Usually in July she's here for 2 weeks. She has garden parties. I can honestly say I've never been invited to a garden party by the Queen. Then again, she's never been to any of my barbecues in my garden either. So I think it's pretty equal on that basis there. But the Royal Mile changes its name all the way down. So it's changed its name about 5 times. So we're going to stick specifically to the Lawnmarket. And it's called the Lawnmarket because this is where people would dry their sheets out on the lawns. Before it all became paved over and put cobblestones in here, this is where people would come out, do the laundry and dry their laundry while they were here. So maybe we can cross over the street here. We'll just have to be a little bit careful. For those of you coming over here soon from the United States, remember we drive on the wrong side. You have to be careful when you're crossing the road. So let's cross over now. We're going to cross. I'm going to take you down one of these little closes. Down the whole of the Royal Mile, there are little alleyways. They look dark and foreboding, but please go into them. They're worthwhile to go into. They do look dark, they do look foreboding. Oh look, we've even got some bagpipes for you. Can you hear the bagpipes? Hope you can hear them as well. I'm going to take you into Milnes Court. Now I don't know if you can pick it up on the camera here, Mike, but if you look above here, above the portico here, you'll see a date, 1690. Now 1690, think of it, Edinburgh was a walled city. The population was growing, people were living on top of each other, the buildings were getting higher and higher and higher. Now think of what was happening in 1690. This is when King James of the Stuart dynasty was kicked off the throne. William and Mary were coming over to take over during the Glorious Revolution. Think of what was happening in the United States in 1690. But here, they were building these beautiful stone buildings and they're still here to this day. So let's walk into one of these buildings here. The one I'm taking you into is Milnes Court. Now James Milne came from a whole family of architects and masons. And this is one of the first open squares built in the in the Royal Mile of Edinburgh at the Lawnmarket area. And you had to be really well-to-do to live in these parts here. Now we'll make it into this, you can see it's really dark, it's really foreboding. See how narrow the thing's here. But you have to imagine the life that was taking place. There'd be traders, there'd be hustle and bustle running up and down here. The whole thing is on a slope, which is relevant because Edinburgh is built on hills, all hills. One of the things about Edinburgh you'll see when you come here, it's a magical place. All the hills seem to go up and none of them seem to come down again. It's really weird in the city, you always seem to be climbing a hill. Let's walk inside. As you walk inside, you come off the main street and everything gets a little bit quieter because this is where life would take place. And we go into the square and you see how it opens up. Now look at the height of the buildings here. You're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 floors on this side of the building. But if I was to continue down this alleyway here, down to the bottom of the hill here, there'd be another 4 or 5 floors added onto there. Maybe Mike can pick that up. So these were some of the tallest buildings in Europe at the time, made of stone. But that in itself caused problems. You had 8, 9, 10, even 12-storey buildings in Edinburgh at the end of the 1600s, beginning of the 1700s. But this caused big issues because people had no running water. No running water meant no flush toilets. So I want you to imagine yourselves back in the 1600s. You're living on, say, the 7th or 8th floor. It's the middle of January. It's very cold and it gets dark very early. So say about 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, you realise that, you need to go to the toilet. You didn't have toilets. You had to use your potty under your bed. But you realise your potty was full. What are you going to do with the potty? Well, you did what everybody else in Edinburgh did in those days. You opened up your window, you shouted Gardyloo, and you throw the contents out the window. Yeah. So you have to imagine Edinburgh in those days wasn't the most hygienic of places. You had all the animals running around, the horses, people kept cows in the city, etc. So there's a lot of ordure in the city. So it wasn't a very pleasant place to walk around. Now, why would they shout Gardyloo? Well, Gardyloo comes from the French Gardilot. Gardilot means beware of the water. But it wasn't just water that came down in your head, it was the whole contents. So when you're in Edinburgh and you're walking through the streets of Edinburgh and you're walking down the Royal Mile, somebody shouts Gardyloo, do not look up. Head for cover, or at least keep your mouth shut. You don't know what's going to land on your head. Now, why would you speak French here? Well, French was very widely spoken. If you know your history, Mary, Queen of Scots, grew up in France. Her mother, Marie de Guise, ruled over here in Mary's absence. Mary grew up in France, her mother ruled here. And if you wanted to ingratiate yourself with the monarch, you would speak French. However, if you were well-to-do and you lived in these apartments here, you would employ little maids. And the little maids did not speak French, so they corrupted the French language. So Gardylot became Gardyloo. This is why, to this day, throughout Great Britain, when we say we're going to the toilet, we still say we're going to the loo. There you are, a little secret unravelled for you. How about that? So I'm going to take you back onto the Royal Mile again. I hope you've got a good idea of the architecture that's here. This is now part of the University of Edinburgh. It was refurbished and repurposed. It now forms part of the University of Edinburgh. Official residences here, mainly postgraduates that live here. And it was reopened in 1971 as a university residence, trying to keep and maintain the original architecture. A beautiful little space to come into. Let's go into another one of our little closes. Why do we call them a close? Well, it's quite easy. It's an alleyway. It's closed over. So we're in a close. I hope you're all getting this and looking at it and getting wonderful architecture. Now, I've known a few architects who've come to Edinburgh from different parts of the United Kingdom, and they all say that when they go to architecture school, one of the places that they have to go to on their courses, they have to come to Edinburgh and see the architecture. Such an eclectic mix of architecture throughout the whole city. Now, we showed you the church here, which is now the hub. That's a neo-Gothic style. If you like neo-Gothic architecture, and if that is to your taste, Edinburgh will give you a feast to go on with. It's got amazing neo-Gothic architecture. Let's take a little walk. You can see it's live. Hey, buddy. It's a live broadcast. Edinburgh's beginning to open up again. You'll be pleased to know. So the shops are beginning to open up. The restaurants are opening up. Tourists are coming back again, which is great to see. Barbers are opening up, and I'm going to see a barber this week as well. So you begin to feel the pulse of the city coming back again. So we're back on the Royal Mile. Now, the Royal Mile is a great place to walk around. There's lots of pubs, lots of restaurants, very lively. And I did mention the Edinburgh Festival. The Edinburgh hosts one of the biggest cultural festivals in the world. It takes place in the month of August. Unfortunately, this year, for obvious reasons, it's been cancelled. But one of the big events during the Edinburgh International Festival is the military tattoo. If you're booking your holiday in Scotland and you're going through a tour operator, make sure you ask them for the August tickets. If you're here in August, get tickets for the Edinburgh Military Tattoo. It's one of the best shows in the world. So I'm going to take you back in. So that close there, we were there in 1690. About 30 years later, another close was built. And this one here is called James Court. So let's go in here. This is one of the narrowest little closes you can see in Edinburgh. And again, as we go through here, try and imagine life back in the early 1700s. People lived on top of each other. So the wealthy and the poor all lived together. Now, if you were wealthy, you did not want to live on the ground floor, because I talked about the Gardyloo. When that stuff was thrown out, there was always the possibility of splashback. So you didn't want to live on the ground floor. you wanted to live maybe in the middle. Higher up you went, well, you didn't want to do rickety stairs. No elevators in those days, so you had to haul yourself up and haul yourself down. And I mentioned about no water. However, they did have public access to water. And they would have gentlemen, usually gentlemen, who would carry the water on their back. And they would come up to your door and they would sell you some water. These were known as water caddies. So those of you who play golf, and you've often wondered where the expression caddy comes from, it comes from the water caddies who carried the water on their back. But look at this, look how narrow this is. You'd have people being pulled here through sedan chairs to keep their feet especially well to do, so they didn't have to walk in all the muck that was on the ground. They'd be on their sedan chairs and they'd be carried through. Let's go inside. I know it looks very, very dark, very foreboding. And even in the winter time in Edinburgh, it becomes so romantic. We have this mist that rolls in. It's kind of like San Francisco. I think a lot of you will be familiar with the mist that rolls in from San Francisco. Well, we have a mist that rolls in from the North Sea. It's called the Har. And when you're here in the autumn or in the winter and the mist rolls in, it becomes very, very spooky indeed. Come on in. So I mentioned that this close started to build it in the early 1700s, opened in the 1730s. A lot of people who were living in the other parts of town saw the benefits of living in these lovely spaces. The apartments were new, they were spacious in those days, and they were expensive, and people started to move in. Some of the famous people, especially at the end of the 1700s, started to move in here. One of the famous people I was referring to would be David Hume. Some of you may know of David Hume as one of the great philosophers. He was known as a man of the Enlightenment. The Scottish Enlightenment was taking place at the end of the 1700s. All of the new ideas, whether it was to do with economics, philosophy, geology, sciences, were all coming out of this city. It was a blossoming city. It was a place of wonder. They said if you're walking down the Royal Mile in Edinburgh at the end of the 1700s, you were walking on the shoulders of giants. Again, look at the wonderful architecture here. How peaceful and how quiet it is. I'll stay quiet for a second. How peaceful. We've only walked about 30 yards from the main street, from the Royal Mile, and we're in here, peace and quiet. Now, David Hume lived here for a while, but I mentioned that they started to build the new town of Edinburgh. And the new town was to the north, where they had wide streets, big houses. And David Hume decided to move out and take himself to the new town. And then another man of letters moved in, James Boswell. James Boswell was again an essayist, and he accompanied Dr. Johnson on his tours around Scotland. And he moved his family into the same apartment that David Hume moved out of. So it was well-to-do, all the philosophers were living here as well, in the period, and such a mixture of cultures going on, of different educations and different social strata. However, as the new town started to develop, these buildings started to fall into disrepair. So during the 1800s, it became quite obvious that to make more money, they were putting more and more people into smaller spaces. People were overcrowded. The conditions became really, really bad in this area. Now, one of the things that had to happen here was that to save the city, they were either going to have to pull it down or do something about it. Come the hour, come the man. And along comes a man called Patrick Geddes. Patrick Geddes is another one of the great men of Edinburgh. He was a visionary. He was involved in developing landscapes. He knew the power of a great environment and how people had to develop themselves from here. And one of his devotees was a young woman, just come around here. Her name was Susanna Alice Stephen. She was born in 1960. And she studied modern languages, but then she studied landscape gardening in Edinburgh. She started to adopt the philosophy of Patrick Geddes about open spaces and how people thrive with a good environment. And she started the Society of Landscape Gardeners here in Edinburgh. Unfortunately, she was killed in a diving accident in the Galapagos Island. But because she loved coming into this area, And because she knew Patrick Geddes, because Patrick Geddes actually moved his family from a nice part of Edinburgh into these apartments here, which was derelict almost at the time. He reinvented the whole place. She loved coming here. And there's a statue now dedicated to Susanna Alice Stephen. Now here we have, she's a landscape gardener, so we have the little trug, the little basket that you use to carry your plants. You probably will recognize it. And here we have, looks like a parakeet. I like to think of it as the Galapagos Islands, so I'm thinking of Darwin's finches. So I like to think of this as a little dedication as she died in the Galapagos Islands. So Susanna Alice Stephen. Now, I would highly recommend that when you're here in Edinburgh, please come into these closes and observe it and just take in the culture and take in the architecture of the place. It's astonishing when you come in here. You might get the impression that we're very proud of our city. You're not wrong. We know we're custodians of the city. We've got to look after it, but we'd love to welcome you here. Now at this point, Mike and I are going to do a switch around. So if you just excuse me for 1 second, Mike will come, he'll pick up the story with Patrick Geddes and we'll take you through the rest of the tour. So bear with me 1 second. There we are. So say hello to Mike.
Hello, welcome to this half of the tour. It's been a great pleasure working with Joe here, and I'm going to pick up the remainder of this walk, this wander through the beautiful old town, what we call the Lawnmarket of Edinburgh. And we've just got this wonderful installation here, as Joe's been talking about. And I'm just going to move onwards a bit. So this is called, as you were saying, James Court, James Brownhill, who designed here, and it was all about opening up spaces because Edinburgh went through different periods in the Old Town especially, where people were living together, all sorts of social classes mixed together. So sometimes the wealthier people, the merchants, would be staying beside the humblest kitchen maid or boy who would sweep out the grates of the wealthier people. So things changed though. This was, during the 18th century, there was a move away from here into the new town of Edinburgh, 1767, and it became very overcrowded for a while. Landlords took over what had normally been owner-occupiers, wealthy merchants who were letting out rooms in their houses. So it got really depressed and very poor here, and people sometimes couldn't even access the old town very much because so much emphasis was on the new town. So one Patrick Geddes that Joe was talking about, he was like a town planner and sociologist, and he decided no, he was going to remain in the old town and put the emphasis here. He said we had to be mindful of the care and the health and the comfort of everybody, and not to focus on the wealthy few with their lavish parks and roads and the new towns. So he was a bit of a wild card, but he was giving what this old town needed. He was bringing back people to stay here. It was not the easiest place to get around for carriages in particular. So if you were coming up here into the old town with its windy streets, then you needed maybe a sedan chair, or you wouldn't come up at all during the 18th century. So there was deprivation. Many of the 17th century buildings were wooden. They were taken down and levelled. There was always a hazard of fire, and with the 17th century buildings also collapses. So not a very safe place to be. But Patrick Geddes opened it up. What he calls conservative surgery in a way. He would take away certain bits and leave other bits, what he thought were the really significant bits. And you can see his mark in many of these wonderful buildings that we've still got here, but with slight additions which are not out of place. So we're going to come here into this area where Ladies' Stairs Close is, and in closes in Edinburgh they mean little accesses or closed areas. Used to be gated when people at the end of these closes wanted protection and security, so we have this closed access. But many of the closes today, funnily enough, are open and we can wander freely. So we're just going to have a little wander. Now, this area has got what we call the Writers' Museum, and it was a merchant's house going back to the 17th century, and it was occupied by Sir William Grey. Now, these wealthy merchants who had ships and would be transporting goods out of Scotland into Europe and many countries abroad, they would be accumulating wealth and were able to occupy some wonderful buildings. And this here, if we look at above, we have got what is called a marriage lintel, and it gives the names, or rather initials, of the significant people. So we've got WG for William Grey, and we've got Gyda Smith, his wife, and the date. And some people think, well, that's the date of their marriage, but often it was the date of the building being ready to occupy. So we've got 1622 here today. It's much changed. It was much plainer originally in the 17th century, but with the influence of Sir Patrick Geddes, and goodness knows what a great influence he was, because this place would have been taken down in the 19th century had it not been for him saving it. But by saving it, they had to make it habitable, they had to make it beautiful, and so you can see some 19th century additions here today. It is free to access, the Writers' Museum, and it tells a story of Robert Louis Stevenson, Sir Walter Scott and Robert Burns, who are our significant writers, notable heroes of Scottish literature and poetry. It's also called Maker's Court, and from the old Scot, Makers meaning Maker's Court, and we have fragments of poetry and writing from many of our great heroes of literature here as well on the paving. So many people pause here to have a little look, and I think now we are more aware of the female importance and the influence of Edinburgh's development, and we've got, I believe, 11 female authors in the paving, which you can see here, and included, of course, Muriel Spark, who wrote The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, but we've got also Helen Cruikshank, and we have got Nan Shepherd, and many more. So women were very important in the history of our city. And over here, I'll walk over. By the way, the kilt I'm wearing today is McNaughton tartan kilt. This is my family tartan. My mother's name was McNaughton, so it's a kind of muted version of it here. Now, this monument, I love this because this is about humanity. It's called the Scottish War Poets' Corner, and because of warfare and what it did to human beings, their mental health state and so on, many were mentally hugely affected by the First World War in particular, and they had to come and be rehabilitated in a hospital here in Edinburgh, and some of them actually wrote poetry. And one of those soldiers was Wilfred Owen, and some of the most beautiful poetry you can read was part of his well-being in coming back to normality. But unfortunately, he became well and went back to France, and he was killed in action. But this is a wonderful little monument to the memory of these people. There's quite a few of them. Also, the 1 o'clock gun, maybe some of you have been in Edinburgh and maybe heard the 1 o'clock gun, a tradition time signal, but it was thought that it was not good to have these people who were recovering from warfare and to be anywhere near a gun going off. So they had to make sure they weren't around the centre of town or the castle around about 1 o'clock. But today the 1 o'clock gun still fires at the castle. So I did a little walk around here in Maker's Court. It's one of the ideal plans that Patrick Geddes had in mind to have these open courtyards to let sunlight in, a basic need for human beings rather than being crammed together as they had been before in very overcrowded rooms. Sometimes you had 30 people, at least 30 people in one room in the old town of Edinburgh, and he was wanting to get away from that. Now over here, this is quite significant if you're interested in Gaelic and Scottish culture and Celtic culture, because this cream-coloured building is called Blackie House, and John Stuart Blackie was a professor of Celtic studies at Edinburgh University. There had not been no such thing before, because they wanted to suppress the native language of the Highlands, and he had run-ins with the Free Church of Scotland in a way too. He was a bit of a wild card, Professor Blackie. And today we have the School of Scottish Studies at part of Edinburgh University to this day, but it would not have been had it not been for John Stuart Blackie. And Patrick Geddes named this building after him. So a very forward thinker. Okay. Very quiet just now. Unusually quiet. We're opening up, but sometimes at this time of year in the past, if you came in here, there would be lots of people. Having my water, which is out of the tap, because Scottish water is about the best water. It's soft water, and of course you will maybe have heard about our national drink, whiskey, and we couldn't make it unless we had that really good water, so I always fill this up before I go on a tour here. Now, I want to draw your attention just up here to these dragons. This is called Wardrop's Court, this area here, because Wardrop was a baxter or a baker. That's where the name comes from. He occupied a house here, but if you look up at the dragons, they were put here by Arthur Geddes, who was the son of Patrick Geddes. And it's very significant that they're here today. So we'll take a wander through Wardrop's Close. Remember, closed access. Another thing I love, people tend, it's these not to see them, sometimes there are these ghost signs where you see remnants of past businesses. For instance, you've got, I think it's a Geddes bookbinder, but of course this is a city of literature, a UNESCO World Heritage Site also. And we, funnily enough, have got other dragons, which were earlier dragons, and they were crafted by another person, another craftsman. But the Geddes one's very significant. I'm going to take us in front of this building here, and Professor Patrick Geddes was a great educationalist. He wanted to boost the accommodation of people studying and the university, and this was university halls originally. Now, behind here had been a wooden, very kind of basic frontage, and this was all remodeled in the 19th century, and we have got some amazing sculpted heads. And up here, you can see this one is an architect, and it's all about moving forward, architects, care and building, and all of that sort of thing. So the tools of the trade are in there for building, for designing, okay, that he's holding. Now, if we move along a bit more, and this vision of Patrick Geddes was going to be a university hall for women students, and Edinburgh's well known for training some of the first women doctors. There was a bit of an anti-female belief that women should practice medicine. Even Queen Victoria thought that that was not to be allowed, but Edinburgh, being a city of enlightenment, nurtured women going into medicine. So you can see a female face, a female student's face here on the second relief statue that I'm pointing out here too. Now move further up. This one here is a boy student, and he's got his satchel there and books and sports. I see actually a cricket bat there as well, and there's other things as well, and I'm sure the younger generation would be able to recognise a few other details in that here.
So Mike, we've got Barb, Batty and Massabrook saying she got her kilt shot in this area.
Fabulous, fabulous. Kilt's the best, are the best. Okay. You can look down ladies' stairs close there. Just what I was saying before, a closed access, very narrow. And so this is Gladstones Land, and just what I was talking about earlier, when the wealthy merchants used to occupy the old town before the new town came into being, would have properties that they would let out to various people. There's a lot I could say, but I'm going to keep it fairly brief because we've just got about another 5 minutes in the tour here. But if you notice the golden bird is called a gled, which in Scots means a hawk or red kite, and it's got a mouse or rat in its, it should probably be a mouse, but it looks quite big. But anyway, and behind that, well, it's a pun on the name Gladstone because it was gled. Now, if you notice the windows, glass didn't come into being until the 17th century, and only very wealthy people could afford it. You notice the half-shuttered windows. These would be full-shuttered before the 17th century, and to keep your interior warm, you would have to have big open fires, you would have to have tapestries to put in front of the windows and the gaps to stop the drafts coming out. But these are half-shuttered, which would be the ideal for any merchant. Once again, as Joe was saying, these were tall buildings. We didn't have a lot of space. We wanted to cram in as many people as they could. But he was a clever guy, Thomas Gladstones, because he let out the nicest part of the property. He could have occupied it himself, but he knew that he'd get more income by giving it to some wealthy person, and that was usually the bit at the front. Now, up the top there, and I don't know that you're going to see it very well, but there's two bits sticking out where the drain pipe is, and they have the initials of Thomas Gladstone, TG, and also his wife Bessie Cunningham. They're called skew butts in architecture, but it's something that somebody wouldn't normally notice. Here is the external stair. They didn't have a way to put stairways through floors, so it had to be an external separate structure there. Now they're keeping a pig or other livestock because this was the Lawnmarket. Lawnmarket comes from land market, and it meant countryside around about this area where you would grow vegetables, where there would be dairy products, and it would be sold here. But also from the connection with cloth, because we think perhaps lawn could have a connection with linen, and we know for sure that Thomas Gladstone was a cloth merchant, so there would be cloth on sale here too. Now, we're just going to cross over. You get behind me St Giles. Joe and I are going to do more walking tours of the old town, and we'll at some point be talking about St Giles Cathedral. So keep an eye open for the posts on the live tours we're doing. Now finally, we're going to take you down this little access. You can hear the piper. Yeah, you can see that building. It's hugely tall. That is just amazing. It's the National Trust for Scotland who run it, who are a kind of charitable body, and just like everything just now, they are experiencing problems with the pandemic in terms of funding. So people are hoping that we don't lose any of that great history. So we're coming down this little close again. This is Riddles Court. Now it goes back to the 17th century, when those 17th century houses here had lavish open gardens which stretched down the hill behind it, but with the improving of access into the old town and the roads being put in, Victoria Terrace behind all that changed and was taken away. Riddles Court has great connections with Professor Patrick Geddes, And it was said, a famous quote by a student, it was a university hall. He eventually took it over in the 19th century. It had gone through various transitions before that. It had been a library, had been one of the first libraries before public library, like a subscription library where you could get books to educate yourself, so it's a very enlightened place. But it was said Professor Geddes brought this place to light, he is quoted as saying, and the message of coming here spread to all different peoples of different lands who would come to wonder at its fabulous interiors and architectural design here. So it was a university hall which the students were absolutely enchanted with. And today it still fulfills an educational function here at Riddles Court. And we have just above the doorway here Vivendo Decimus, which means learning through life, through our everyday life experiences, which connects very much again with this great man, Professor Patrick Geddes. Now, I think
from Margie Hutchison in Ontario, in Canada.
Oh, hi Margie, nice to see you. I remember us going around Scotland, and I hope you'll be back one of these days. So nice that you've come on this live tour. Fantastic. Okay, so this is gated up at the moment. It's also a venue during the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, and it's also got connections with James Boswell and David Hume when it happened to be a residential area too. And again, it's one of the hidden gems if you come off the main Lawnmarket street to come up here and linger and wonder and look at the tall buildings, the way people still live today in these areas, residential occupation here today. Okay, I'm going to just wind up there, I think, and thank you very much for joining our tour. And I don't know if Joe wants to come in and say cheerio.
Well, we've got Karen Herman from Western Australia, from Perth, Western Australia. The pressures of being a tour guide, now we're going to do it live. We're broadcasting to the world, Mike. We've got another one here, Barb, from USA. Great to see you guys.
Well, I'd just like to wind up and say we're Blue Badge Guides, STJA. We did training through Edinburgh University, and we've been trained into the professional skills of guiding, and Joe and I are local Edinburgh guides. So when you come to Scotland, hopefully in not too distant future, look out for us, STJA, Scottish Tourist Guides Association, and we are both on there. So thanks very much for joining, and I'll just bring in Joe to say cheerio, but goodbye from me.
And I'll say goodbye from him as well. So it's goodbye from us. So it's goodbye. And if you want a shout out the next time, get in touch with us and we'll give you a shout out as well. It's great. We've got Canada, we've got the US, we've got Australia, we've got England, we've got France. We're going through the world here. So glad you could join us. We'll keep you posted on our next tour. Stay safe, and if you need to, stay indoors. Thank you very much for joining us. See you next time.